She had spent 32 years being invisible. Not the quiet kind of invisible that comes with shyness or grace, but the kind that comes from being told over and over again that you are too much and not enough all at once. Too heavy, too plain, too easy to overlook. Margaret Doyle had carried those words the way other women carried perfume pressed into her skin until she couldn't remember a time before them. But then a yellowed piece of newspaper fell out of a library book on a Tuesday morning in October, and the words on that small, crooked advertisement changed the entire direction of her life. If you're watching this story right now, I want you to stay with me until the very end, because this is the kind of story that reminds us what we're all really worth. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The apartment on Corwin Street smelled like boiled cabbage and old arguments. It was a second-floor walk-up in the south end of Boston, narrow as a coffin and twice as cold in winter, with radiators that clanged and hissed through the night like something trapped inside the walls was trying to get out. Margaret Doyle had lived there for 6 years, not because she wanted to and not because she could afford somewhere better, but because her sister Helen had asked her to move in and help with the children, and Margaret had said yes, the way she always said yes to Helen, without stopping to think whether she had any other choice. The apartment belonged to Helen and her husband, Rodney Fitch. It had 2 bedrooms, one for Helen and Rodney, one for their 3 children, and a pull-out sofa in the living room where Margaret slept with a quilt her mother had made, and a pillow she'd brought from her last place, a rooming house on Beacon Street, where she'd paid her own rent and eaten her own food and gone to bed when she pleased. She thought about that rooming house sometimes in the dark hours before the children woke. She thought about it the way you think about a country you can never go back to. In exchange for the sofa and whatever food was left after supper, Margaret cooked 3 meals a day, laundered every piece of clothing in the household, minded the children from the time they woke until Rodney came home in the evenings, cleaned the apartment twice a week, and did whatever else Helen decided needed doing. Helen called this arrangement helping each other out. Rodney called Margaret the live-in when he was in a good mood, and that woman when he wasn't. The children, Ruthie, Danny, and the baby, whose name was Clara, but whom everyone called Button, called her Aunt Maggie, and climbed on her and brought her rocks and drawings and half-eaten crackers, the way children bring treasures to the people they trust most. Margaret loved those children with a fierceness that surprised even her. But she was tired. Down to the marrow tired. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't touch. She was 32 years old in the autumn of 1883, and she thought, every year of it. She had her mother's soft brown eyes and her father's broad build, and a face that people called kind-looking when they were being generous and said nothing about when they weren't. She was what the women on her block called a big girl, not cruelly but matter-of-factly the way you'd say it was raining or the bread had gone stale. She had given up fighting that description sometime in her mid-20s after the last time a man had walked her home from a church social and then chosen her thinner, sharper-faced friend instead. After that, she had turned her considerable energy toward cooking because food at least did not reject her. Food responded to her hands. Food rewarded her attention and patience and care in ways that people rarely did. Her biscuits were famous on Corwin Street. Her beef stew made grown men close their eyes when they ate it. Her apple pie had once caused old Mr. Hennessy from the 3rd floor to sit in silence for a full minute before saying very quietly, "Mrs., if I were 30 years younger and my wife weren't still living, I'd propose to you on the spot." Margaret had laughed and told him to stop his foolishness. But she had thought about it for 3 days afterward. On the morning that changed everything, she had been up since before dawn, getting the children's oatmeal started and putting on a second pot of coffee for Rodney, who would appear at 7 sharp and demand to know why breakfast wasn't ready, even though it always was. Helen had a headache. Helen often had headaches on Mondays, and so Margaret had laid out the children's school clothes as well braided Ruthie's hair, while Danny ate and Button threw her oatmeal against the wall with the cheerful malice that only very small children can muster. After Rodney left and Helen went back to bed, and the older 2 children had been walked to school, Margaret put Button down for her morning nap and allowed herself 30 minutes. This was the agreement she had made with herself, 30 minutes every morning after the first wave of work before the second. She used these 30 minutes to sit at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and either read or simply stare out the window at the alley below, where pigeons argued over scraps and the ash man came on Tuesdays. That morning she was reading or trying to. The library book she'd borrowed, a history of the Western Territories that she'd requested on a whim, kept falling open to the same page where someone had tucked a folded piece of newspaper between chapters 11 and 12. She'd noticed it before and ignored it, but that morning, perhaps because she was tired in that particular bone-deep way that makes a person reckless, she unfolded it. It was a small advertisement cut from what appeared to be a Montana territorial paper, the date worn away at the fold. The typeface was plain, the language plainer. Wanted a wife, rancher widower. Honest man, 45 years. Has a son, 10. Has land and means. Does not require beauty. Requires honesty, steadiness, willingness to work. Would prefer a woman who means what she says and says what she means. Letters only to T. Callahan, Harlow Creek, Montana Territory. Margaret read it twice. Then she set it down and drank her coffee and looked out the window at the pigeons. Then she read it a third time. Does not require beauty. She had been told her whole life in ways both direct and indirect that beauty was the primary currency a woman had to spend. Her sister Helen, slim, auburn-haired, possessed of the kind of fine-boned delicacy that men opened doors for, had leveraged hers into a marriage by 20 and a household by 22. Their mother, God rest her, had told Margaret from girlhood that she would need to work twice as hard as pretty girls because she hadn't been given that particular gift, and she'd said it the way you'd tell a child they were left-handed. Not cruel, just practical, just bracing them for the shape of the world. And the world had confirmed it repeatedly without apology. But this man, this T. Callahan of Harlow Creek, Montana, had written in plain black ink on a public page that he did not require beauty. He required honesty. He required steadiness. He required a woman who meant what she said. Margaret sat with that for a long moment. Then she got up, went to the small writing desk in the corner of the living room where Helen kept her correspondence paper, and took out 2 sheets and an envelope. She sat back down at the kitchen table. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Callahan, my name is Margaret Doyle. I am 32 years old, unmarried, and living in Boston. I am not a beauty. I want to say that plainly since you were plain with me and you said you valued honesty. I am a large woman, brown-eyed with steady hands and a strong back. I cook well. I work without being asked. I do not whine or waste or lie. I have spent the last 6 years keeping house for my sister's family, and I am good at it, but I am no longer willing to do it for people who do not see me. I want a place of my own. I want work that belongs to me, and I will admit, though it costs me something to write it, that I want to be chosen. Not because I am beautiful, just because I am me, and that is enough. I don't know if you are a good man. I only know what you wrote, and what you wrote sounded honest. I am willing to find out the rest if you are. I have enclosed no photograph since you did not ask for one. If that is a problem, I understand. Respectfully, Margaret Doyle." She folded the letter, sealed the envelope, and addressed it in her careful, even handwriting. Then she put on her coat, walked to the post office on Washington Street, and mailed it before she could change her mind. She did not tell Helen. She did not tell anyone. She walked home through the October streets with the wind coming off the harbor and the smell of wood smoke and fish and something cold on its way, and she felt for the first time in a very long time like a person who had just done something that belonged entirely to herself. 3 weeks passed without a word. Margaret had expected this. She had mailed the letter and then systematically dismantled any hope attached to it, brick by careful brick, because hope was expensive and she had learned to be frugal with it. She went back to her mornings and her oatmeal and Rodney's coffee and Button's oatmeal on the wall, and she told herself it had been a foolish impulse, a tired woman's fantasy, and that was fine. Some things were just foolish impulses, and that was fine too. Then one morning in early November, when the first real cold had come down from the north, and Helen was complaining about the heating, and Rodney had not yet paid the coal man, Margaret found a letter in the post box with her name on it. The handwriting was large and unpracticed, not illiterate, but the handwriting of a man who wrote rarely, who held the pen like a tool rather than an instrument. The postmark said Harlow Creek, Montana. She did not open it until she had Button down for her nap and Helen out doing her marketing. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and the letter, and she opened it with the butter knife because she did not want to tear it. "Miss Doyle, I am not a man who writes letters. My brother was the one who placed the advertisement before he died this past spring. I found it in his things, and I thought, I don't know what I thought. I kept it. I suppose that means something. I have received 14 replies. I read all of them. Most of them told me about their hair or their figures or what a good Christian household they would run. 3 of them sent photographs. Yours was the only one that told me something true. I don't know if you are right for this life. It is hard. Montana is not Boston. The winters here would take the spirit out of a weaker person, and some summers aren't much better. My ranch is called the Iron Fork. It has good land and good cattle, and it takes everything a person has just to keep it running. My son's name is Eli. He is 10 years old, and he does not want a new mother. I am telling you this plainly because you asked for plainness. If you are still willing to come, I will send fare for the train. I cannot promise you love. I cannot promise you easy. I can promise you honest work, honest wages, a room of your own, and a fair chance. That is all I have to offer. Thomas Callahan. Margaret read the letter through twice. Then she set it on the table and looked out the window for a long time. My brother was the one who placed the advertisement before he died this past spring. That one sentence turned something over in her chest. He hadn't been looking. He'd inherited a dead brother's advertisement and a dead brother's idea, and something in him, some piece of him that was still reaching, even if he wouldn't name it, had decided to honor it, or maybe just to try. She didn't know which, but either way it was honest, and she had asked for honesty. My son does not want a new mother, at least he'd said it. She got up, went to the writing desk, and took out paper again. Dear Mr. Callahan, send the fare. Margaret Doyle. No. She left on the 14th of November. She did not tell Helen until the night before. She had spent the intervening weeks quietly, systematically arranging the practical architecture of departure. She had written to a woman she knew, who cleaned houses and asked her to come Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays for Helen. She had cooked and frozen as much as the icebox would hold. She had written out in careful detail every recipe and household schedule that Helen had never bothered to learn because Margaret had always been there to execute it. When she finally told Helen over supper on the 13th, sitting at the table she had scrubbed that morning, for the last time Helen's face went through several emotions, rapidly shock offense, and then a cold narrowing that Margaret recognized as the expression Helen got when she felt something had been done to her without her permission. You're leaving, Helen said. Not a question. Yes. For Montana. Helen said it the way someone says a word in a foreign language they can't quite believe is real. For a ranch in Montana, yes, I'm going to be married. Helen's fork went down on the plate with a sound like a small accusation. To whom you don't know anyone in Montana. You've never even been west of Albany. I've been corresponding with a man named Thomas Callahan. He's a widower, a rancher. He placed an advertisement. The silence that followed was the particular silence of someone assembling an argument. Maggie, Helen's voice had shifted to the tone she used when she was being patient at great personal cost. You answered a mail-order bride advertisement. I did. Those are for, Helen stopped, started again. Those are for women who have no other options. Margaret looked at her sister for a moment, looked at the kitchen she had cooked in for 6 years, the floor she had swept the children's plates, she had washed the window above the sink, she had looked out of 10,000 times wondering. Yes, she said, I know. Helen flushed. That's not what I meant. I think it is a little. Margaret kept her voice even. And I'm not angry about it. I think you've believed for a long time that I didn't have other options, and I think I believed it too for a while. I'm going to find out if that's true. He hasn't even seen you. Helen said it like it was a warning, like it was the cruelest fact available. Margaret thought about that small advertisement. Does not require beauty. She thought about the letter she'd sent, and the letter she'd gotten back the handwriting of a man who held his pen like a tool, who had said plainly that he couldn't promise love. No, she said, he hasn't. She paused, and he chose me anyway. The train journey from Boston to Billings, Montana took 4 days. Margaret had made the journey in a second-class car with a carpet bag, a small trunk, and a tin box that contained her most important possessions, her mother's quilt folded small, a packet of letters tied with kitchen twine, her recipe book, which was not actually a book, but a collection of loose pages covered in her own handwriting tucked into a worn leather folder, and $23.40, which was every cent she had saved over 6 years of working in Helen's house, coin by careful coin, against a future she had refused to stop believing in, even when she couldn't see it. She watched the landscape change through the train window with the focused attention of someone memorizing a route back out of the tight, familiar density of the eastern cities and into the open chest of the continent, through the long miles of Ohio and Indiana, and then the enormous sky of the plains, that sky that kept getting bigger and bigger, until she understood in her body why people said the West was a different country. It wasn't just different, it was wider. The ski was wider. The silence was wider. The distances between things were wider than anything her Boston bones had prepared her for. She was afraid. She was the particular kind of afraid that is indistinguishable from excitement, the kind where your chest is tight and your hands don't quite settle. And every time you think about turning back, there's something that says, no, go forward, in a voice that sounds like your own best self. She thought about Thomas Callahan's letter. I cannot promise you love. I cannot promise you easy. She had known enough hard men in her life, her father who had been a drinker, Rodney who was small in his soul, even when he was sober, to know the difference between a man who was cold because he was wounded and a man who was cold because cruelty was the only language he spoke. She thought the letter sounded like a wounded man. She had no guarantee of that. But she had always been, for better or worse, a person who bet on the possibility of better. She arrived in Billings on a Monday afternoon and transferred to a smaller line that took her another 60 miles west to the town of Harlow Creek, arriving at dusk on a Tuesday. The station was small, a platform, a ticket office, a water tower. There were 3 other people getting off. A man met each of them. One man was waiting at the far end of the platform apart from the others. He was tall, very tall, with a rancher's build lean through the middle and broad across the shoulders, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low against the cold. He was standing with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the train, and when Margaret stepped down onto the platform with her carpet bag and her trunk being carried behind her by the porter, his eyes found her and settled there. She had expected the look. She had braced for it. She was not entirely prepared for it. It was not disgust. She had steeled herself for disgust, and she would have known how to answer it. It was something more complicated than that. His face, which she could see now as she crossed the platform, a weathered face, square-jawed with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind, went through something she couldn't quite name. A quick, carefully controlled recalibration. A man taking in information he hadn't fully prepared for and deciding what to do with it. She stopped in front of him. She was not going to pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. Mr. Callahan, she said, I'm Margaret Doyle. Before we go any further, I want to say that I know I'm not what you pictured, and I don't need you to pretend otherwise. I told you in my letter I wasn't a beauty, and here I am. If that's a problem, I'd rather know now than later. He looked at her for a moment. Up close, he had gray at his temples and eyes the color of creek water in October, a kind of dark, shifting hazel that was not quite green and not quite brown. He had not shaved in a day or two. He looked like a man who had been working since before dawn and would be working again before dawn tomorrow. Miss Doyle, he said. His voice was low and flat, a Western voice, economical. I asked for honesty. You gave me that. The offer stands. He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing, turned, and walked toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the platform. Margaret stood for 1 second watching him go. Then she picked up her carpet bag and followed. A boy sat in the wagon seat. He was small for 10, with his father's jaw and his father's watchful eyes, and he looked at Margaret the way an animal looks at something it has not decided about yet. Not hostile, not welcoming, just assessing with an economy of expression that was almost eerie in a child. Eli, Tom said, loading the trunk into the wagon bed. This is Miss Doyle. The boy looked at her. You're fat, he said. There was a silence. Margaret looked at the boy. The boy looked back without a trace of self-consciousness, the way children state what they see before they have learned that some truths are impolite. I am, she said, and you've got your father's eyes. We're both stuck with what we've got. Something shifted in the boy's face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one there and gone. He looked away. Tom had gone still at the side of the wagon. Now he turned and looked at her. Not the flat assessment from the platform, but something sharper, with a flicker of surprise in it that he hadn't bothered to hide fast enough. He helped her up onto the wagon seat without a word. They drove through the dark toward the Iron Fork Ranch, and nobody spoke. And the sky above them was so thick with stars that Margaret, who had grown up under Boston's orange-lit sky, had to press her lips together to keep from making a sound at the sight of it. This is the West, she thought. This is where I've come. She didn't know yet if it would be home, but she had arrived. She was here. She had done the terrifying, improbable, necessary thing, and she was here. That for this first night was enough. The Iron Fork Ranch lay 7 miles outside of Harlow Creek, at the end of a road that was barely a road 2-wheel ruts through grass that had gone gold and brittle in the November cold. The darkness was total out here, the kind of darkness that Boston with its gas lamps and close buildings never got. Margaret watched the shapes of hills resolve and dissolve in the moonlight and tried to calibrate her expectations downward because she had learned that the most reliable way to be surprised by something good was to expect nothing at all. The house, when they reached it, was larger than she'd expected. A 2-story frame house, unpainted gray in the moonlight, with a covered porch running the full front length and outbuildings clustered behind barn. What looked like a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, several structures she couldn't identify in the dark. The house had 6 windows on the front face, all dark except one on the ground floor that glowed amber, and as the wagon pulled up, a man came out of the bunkhouse with a lantern and took the horses, nodding once at Tom and not looking at Margaret at all. "Your room is upstairs," Tom said. He carried her trunk up without being asked. The staircase was narrow and steep, the wood worn smooth by however many years of use. He set the trunk down in a room on the 2nd floor, small, simply furnished with a bed and a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the dark yard and lit the lamp on the dresser. "There's water in the pitcher," he said. "Supper was 3 hours ago, but there's bread in the kitchen." "I'll manage," Margaret said. He looked at her once more in the lamplight. His face had settled back into its flat, contained expression, giving nothing away. "Good night, Miss Doyle." "Good night, Mr. Callahan." He pulled the door shut behind him. She heard his boots on the stairs, steady and unhurried. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room. The quilt on the bed was plain but clean. The floor had been swept. Someone, she didn't know who, she would learn later that it had been Tom himself, gruffly 2 nights before she arrived, had put a small bunch of dried wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. She thought about that for a long time. Then she unpacked her mother's quilt, spread it over the bed's plain one, lay down fully dressed, and slept for the first time in weeks without dreaming. She woke at 5 to the sound of the ranch coming alive, the low voices of men, the stamp of horses, a rooster somewhere past the barn. She lay still for one moment, orienting herself in the new dark and the new silence, and the enormous cold that pressed against the window glass. Then she got up, washed her face, put on her work dress, and went downstairs to find the kitchen. It was a large kitchen for a ranch house, a wood range against one wall, a long table down the center shelves of dry goods, a cold pantry off the back. There were the remains of someone's attempt at breakfast, a pot of scorched oatmeal that someone had given up on a coffee pot that had gone cold. She found the coffee and started a fresh pot, then opened the cold pantry and took stock. She had been taught that the first thing you do in a new kitchen is find out what you have to work with. What she had to work with was considerable dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, lard, a good supply of flour, dried apples, potatoes in a sack, a side of bacon hanging from a hook, eggs in a basket, a crock of butter. There was a haunch of beef in the far corner that had been smoked and could be sliced. There were onions braided above the shelf and dried herbs she didn't recognize yet. She put on her apron, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. By the time the sky was pale gray, she had made biscuits, 24 of them, golden bottomed, with the particular lightness that came from working cold butter into the flour fast before your hands could warm it, and a pan of gravy from the bacon drippings, and a pot of soft scrambled eggs with onion, and the last of the salt pork and coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in. She set it all on the long kitchen table and waited. The first man through the door was a ranch hand she hadn't met yet, a lean, weathered man in his 50s named Hank, who stopped just inside the kitchen doorway and looked at the table with the expression of a person encountering something they had not expected at all. "Lord of mercy," he said. He said it very quietly, like a prayer. 3 more men came in after him, younger, trail-worn, looking at her with the wary curiosity of people who had heard something was different today, but hadn't known what. They sat at the table without speaking, served themselves, and then the silence changed its quality. Eli appeared in the doorway in his school clothes, his hair uncombed. He looked at the table. He looked at Margaret. He picked up a biscuit with both hands and took a bite, and his eyes closed involuntarily for just a moment, the way eyes close when something is involuntarily good. He sat down without saying anything and ate 3 biscuits. Tom was the last in. He came through the kitchen door, hat in hand, and stopped at the side of the table. His face did not change dramatically, but his eyes moved from the food to Margaret with a quality of attention she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man recalibrating again, as he had at the train station, adjusting to information that did not fit his prior model of what was possible. He poured his own coffee, sat at the head of the table, and said nothing. When he finished his eggs and biscuits, he set his fork down, looked at the table for a moment as if considering something, and then said without looking at her, "Ranch day starts at 5:30. Hands eat before they ride out. There are 6 of them, including Hank." "I'll have it ready," Margaret said. He nodded once and stood. At the door he paused with his hat halfway to his head. He still didn't look at her. "You're not what I expected," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. It wasn't quite not one either. "I'll take that," she said. He put his hat on and went out, and she could have sworn that in the half-second before the door closed behind him, the line of his mouth, that flat, contained, giving nothing away line, had shifted just slightly in a direction she couldn't name. Harlow Creek was not Boston. This was self-evident, but Margaret spent her first weeks discovering all the specific ways in which it was not Boston, in case self-evidence was not enough. The cold was not the damp, knifing cold of the harbor. It was a dry, total cold that came down out of the mountains and settled over the land like a fact. The wind had no obstacles out here. It arrived from wherever it was going with full force and without apology. The distances were real, not navigable on foot. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles, the town 7, and the town was small enough that its main street could be walked end to end in 3 minutes. The townspeople of Harlow Creek received her with the particular interested ambivalence of a small community, receiving someone new, aware of her, assessing her, withholding judgment, or extending it in ways she could not always read. She was introduced around by Tom briefly on her second day in town as Miss Doyle come to help run the ranch, and she felt the assessments landing on her like small, precise weights. Her size, her Boston accent, her age. The fact that she was not beautiful in any conventional way and not trying to be. She met Claire Whitmore on that second day. Claire Whitmore was 35, a widow herself, the daughter of the man who ran the Harlow Creek Mercantile. She was everything that Margaret was not, in the specific surface way that the world tends to notice first: slim and dark-haired, with fine features, and the kind of careful, deliberate elegance that signals money, or at least the habit of money. She had been in Harlow Creek for 3 years since her husband's death in a mining accident in Colorado, and she had made herself in those 3 years indispensable to a certain tier of the town's social life. She had also, Margaret would come to understand, had her eyes on Tom Callahan for most of those 3 years. "You must be the woman Tom sent for," Claire said, in the Mercantile, extending her gloved hand with a smile that was perfectly warm and perfectly controlled. "I'm Claire Whitmore. I've been a friend to the Callahan Ranch for years." "Margaret Doyle," Margaret said, taking the hand. "It's kind of you to introduce yourself." Claire's eyes moved over her with the same efficiency as Tom's had at the train station, but with a different quality, not recalibration, but confirmation. Like she had expected exactly what she saw and had already factored it into her calculations. "Such a long way to come," Claire said pleasantly. "Boston, I heard it must be quite an adjustment. Montana is very different from what you're used to." "I imagine it'll take some getting used to," Margaret agreed. "Tom is a good man," Claire said. "He's had a difficult time since Eleanor died. He needs someone who understands the land here. The people." A small pause, perfectly timed. "It's not an easy thing to learn." "No," Margaret said, "I don't expect it is." She smiled at Claire Whitmore, who smiled back. 2 hours later, in the Mercantile's back room, Margaret would overhear, through a door left accidentally or deliberately ajar, Claire's voice, low and certain, saying to the storekeeper's wife, "She's not what I expected, though I suppose Tom wasn't exactly in a position to be choosy." Margaret stood in the back room with a can of peaches in her hand and let the words land. She felt them. She was honest enough with herself to admit that they stung, not because they were new, but because they were old, the same words in a different voice following her 2,000 miles from Boston to the back room of a Montana mercantile. She set the peaches down, straightened her shoulders, and went back out into the shop. She had not come this far to be undone by a woman who measured people in inches. That evening after supper, while Eli was doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table, and the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Tom was somewhere in the barn, dealing with a mare that had been off her feed, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen with her recipe book and her coffee. She turned to a clean page and wrote at the top, Iron Fork. November 1883. Below that, she wrote a list of everything she had learned in a week, the names of all 6 ranch hands, the layout of the smokehouse, the state of the pantry, the way the range ran hot on the left side and needed watching, the fact that Eli liked his eggs soft and Hank took his coffee with 3 sugars, and the young hand named Perry was lactose intolerant in a way nobody had ever thought to accommodate. She wrote it all down the way she had always written things down, because writing things down was how she organized the world she was responsible for. Then she turned to another page and wrote in smaller letters the sentence she had been carrying since the back room of the mercantile, "She's not what I expected." She looked at it for a moment. Then below it, she wrote what Tom had said to her that first morning, "You're not what I expected." The same words, 2 different meanings, 2 different weights. She closed the recipe book, finished her coffee, and went to bed. Outside, the Montana wind came down off the mountains and moved through the dark grass with the sound of the sea, and Margaret Doyle lay in her borrowed room under her mother's quilt and thought about what it meant to be chosen by someone who hadn't seen her face, and whether that choice made in the dark across 2,000 miles of continent would hold when the light came up. She didn't know yet, but for the first time in her life, she thought someone chose her, without knowing what she looked like, without the currency of beauty to smooth the way. Just her words, honest and plain, on a page reaching across the country to a man who had asked for honesty and found it. That had to count for something. She was almost sure it did. Viet Teep den Het D3. Part 2, A Stranger in a Harsh Land. The first snow came to the Iron Fork on a Thursday morning in late November, arriving without announcement, in the way that Montana weather announced nothing. It was simply there when Margaret pulled back the curtain at 4:50 in the morning, a white silence that had rewritten the world overnight. The yard, the fence lines, the long slope of the pasture toward the creek, all of it gone under a smooth, pale cover that made the familiar strange and the strange beautiful. She stood at the window for one long moment, her breath fogging the glass. Then she went downstairs and started the fire in the range. She had been at the Iron Fork for 11 days, and she had learned in those 11 days the particular rhythm of the place, the way you learn the rhythm of a new heartbeat, by staying very still and paying close attention. The ranch woke in stages, first the horses, then the hands, then Eli. Then Tom, last of all, though she suspected he had often been awake for an hour before he appeared in the kitchen, out in the barn, or walking the fence lines in the early dark, keeping company with whatever it was that kept him company in those hours before the world required his attention. She had learned that he took his coffee black and did not want conversation with it. She had learned that he checked the weather to the north before he checked anything else every morning, standing at the kitchen door for 30 seconds with his hat in his hand before he put it on and went out. She had learned that he was a man who carried the weight of the ranch the way some men carry debt, constantly, silently, with the set of his jaw and the slight forward lean of his shoulders, as if he were always walking into a wind that only he could feel. She had learned that he watched her in the careful peripheral way of a man who does not want to be caught watching. She had not let on that she noticed. The snow changed the work. Margaret had expected that. She had not fully anticipated the scale of the change. Cattle needed to be brought in from the far pastures. Feed had to be hauled. Water sources checked and broken if they'd frozen over. The hands were out from before first light, and they came in half frozen and ravenous at noon and again at dusk, and the kitchen became the center of everything. The warm engine, the whole operation, ran on the place where cold and hungry men became temporarily something other than cold and hungry. She made soup. She made stews. She made cornbread in the heavy iron pans and hung a pot of beans overnight and had them ready by morning. She made the biscuits, always the biscuits, and she made a molasses cake on Sunday because she'd found the molasses in the back of the pantry and because she believed genuinely in the specific morale-sustaining power of something sweet at the end of a hard week. Hank took a piece of the molasses cake, sat down at the table, and looked at her with an expression of profound and slightly suspicious gratitude. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "My mother," Margaret said, "and then myself." "Your mother was a genius. She would have liked hearing that." Margaret set the rest of the cake on the shelf and covered it with a cloth. "She didn't hear it enough when she was living." Hank ate his cake and said nothing more. But after that, he took it upon himself to make sure her firewood box in the kitchen was always full without being asked and without mentioning it. Margaret noticed and did not mention it either. She understood that men like Hank expressed gratitude the same way they expressed everything else sideways in action without making a production of it. Eli was a different kind of problem. The boy was not cruel. She had braced for cruelty and had found instead a kind of deliberate distance that was in its way more difficult. He did his schoolwork at the kitchen table in the evenings because it was the warmest room and the best lit, but he arranged himself so that he was facing away from her, his books a barrier, his body language communicating with great precision, "I am here. I am not with you." He took his meals and said thank you in the minimal automatic way of a child who has been taught manners without necessarily meaning them. He answered questions in as few words as possible and never initiated conversation. He was, Margaret thought, protecting something. She did not know what it were actually, whether it was grief for his mother or loyalty to his father's solitude or some private theory about what her presence here meant for the life he had understood himself to be living. Probably all three went together in the way that children wind their complicated feelings tightly and without labels. She did not push. She understood about protecting things. She had done a great deal of it herself. What she did was cook the things he liked, soft eggs, as she had already established, and she discovered over time that he also liked dried apple pie, baked beans, any kind of bread with honey, and the particular thick hot chocolate she made from cocoa powder and cream on cold mornings. She did not make a point of noticing that he went back for seconds. She did not comment on it. She simply made sure there were always seconds. It was the Tuesday of her second week when the first crack appeared in Eli's careful wall. He had been at the kitchen table with her arithmetic sums. He was clearly struggling with erasing and rewriting with increasing agitation, the pencil moving harder each time. Margaret was at the stove doing nothing in particular, trying to stay small in the way she had practiced for years. 4 times 17, Eli said suddenly and without preamble, as if the words had escaped before he could stop them. Margaret did not look up from the stove. 68, she said, a pause. How did you do that fast? 4 times 10 is 40, she said, turning to pour the coffee. 4 times 7 is 28. 40 plus 28 is 68. Another pause. She could feel him considering whether to engage with this or retreat back behind his books. What about 9 times 13, he said very carefully, as if the question were a test whose rules he hadn't quite decided on yet. 9 times 10 is 90, Margaret said. 9 times 3 is 27. 90 plus 27 is 117. She set the coffee down and went back to the stove. She heard the pencil moving again, checking her work. Then a silence that had a different quality, not the closed-off silence of before, but the specific, concentrated silence of a child who is thinking. She let him think. She did not make anything of it that evening or the next morning. She kept her manner with him exactly as it had been, steady, undemanding, present, without pressure. 2 days later, he asked her another arithmetic question, and she answered it the same way conversationally as if it were nothing. By the end of the second week, he was showing her his sums before he turned them in. She checked them, corrected the ones that were wrong, showed him why, and handed them back. She did not say, "You're getting it," or "I'm proud of you," or any of the things that adults say to children when they are really saying, "Notice me, respond to me, give me something back." She just checked the sums and handed them back. She had been told her whole life that she was too much. She had discovered here at the Iron Fork that the most valuable thing she could offer was to be exactly enough, no more, no less, precisely calibrated to what was actually needed. It was, she thought, the same skill as cooking. You learned what the thing required, and you gave it that, and you did not add extra out of your own anxiety about whether it was enough. So Tom Callahan remained through those weeks, a man standing slightly outside a room he had not decided whether to enter. He was courteous. He was in the flat, functional way of a man who means to keep his word, exactly what his letter had promised: honest work, honest wages, fair treatment. He paid her every 2 weeks in coins left on the kitchen table while she was elsewhere, which she appreciated without quite being able to explain why. He told her when there were things she needed to know about the ranch and didn't tell her things she didn't need to know, which she also appreciated because she had no appetite for being managed. He ate the food she cooked with the reliable, quiet appreciation of a man who had been eating poorly for a long time and was gradually remembering that it didn't have to be that way. He never complimented the food directly, not once in those first weeks, but she watched him go back for seconds. Watched the way his shoulders settled at the supper table in a way they didn't settle elsewhere. Watched the specific relief in the hands of a man who has been carrying something heavy when he sets it down for an hour. She found him one evening in the second week in the barn with the mare that had been sick, the one he'd been checking on the night she arrived. He was sitting on an overturned crate in the straw beside the stall, his elbows on his knees, talking to the horse in a low voice. She had come to return a harness she'd found in the kitchen that didn't belong there, and she stopped in the barn doorway at the sound of his voice. He was telling the horse about the fence on the east pasture. Specifically and practically, the way you talk to someone who needs to be kept company but doesn't need you to perform for them. He was describing the post that had heaved over winter and needed resetting in spring, and the particular way the creek ran at the east corner after heavy rain, and the fact that the grass on the far slope was better than anywhere else on the property, and always had been ever since his father's time. Margaret stood in the doorway long enough to understand something about him. Then she set the harness on the hook by the door and went back to the house without interrupting. She thought about that voice, that low, unguarded voice, for a long time after. There was a man inside the flat, contained exterior of Thomas Callahan, a man who noticed things and cared about them and talked to horses about fence posts in the evenings because he had perhaps nobody else to say these things to. A man whose brother had died and who had kept an advertisement he hadn't placed because it represented something he had not let himself fully want. A man who had said, "I cannot promise you love the way people say things they are afraid are true." She did not let herself think about that man too directly. She was not here for that man, she told herself. She was here for the work, for the room that was hers, for the fact of having chosen something and been chosen back. That was enough. That was more than she'd had in Boston, and she was not going to be foolish enough to want more than she was owed. She was very firm with herself about this. It helped mostly. Claire Whitmore came to the Iron Fork on a Friday afternoon in early December, arriving in a small buggy, driven by her father's hired man with a basket over her arm and the kind of appearance that communicates deliberateness. Hair carefully arranged, coat well fitted, the deliberate prettiness of a woman who knows she is being looked at and has prepared accordingly. Margaret was in the kitchen making bread when she heard the buggy in the yard. She looked out the window and watched Claire Whitmore step down from the buggy and cross the yard toward the house with the confident stride of someone who has made this trip before and considers it hers to make. She heard Tom's boots on the porch. He had been working the south fence and come in early, and then the low exchange of voices outside. She kept her hands in the bread dough and did not go to the door. A minute later, Tom brought Claire into the kitchen. "Miss Doyle?" he said in the tone he used for practical information. "Mrs. Whitmore has brought provisions." He set a basket on the table. She could see through the cloth that it held a jar of preserves, some wrapped parcels, what looked like a pie. "How kind," Margaret said, keeping her hands in the dough. Claire looked around the kitchen with an expression that was perfectly pleasant and somehow still managed to inventory every detail: the new organization of the shelves, the crock of starter on the counter, the bundles of dried herbs she'd hung from the ceiling beam, the overall transformation of what had apparently been a fairly grim kitchen before her arrival. "You've made changes," Claire said. "A few," Margaret said. "I hope that's all right, Mr. Callahan." "It's your kitchen to run," Tom said, which was, Margaret realized, the first time he had said anything of the kind directly, and she noted it even as she kept her expression even and her hands in the dough. Claire's pleasant expression did not shift. She was too good for that. She set her basket on the table beside Tom's and began taking out the contents with the practiced ease of a woman demonstrating that she was at home here. "I've been bringing provisions when I can," she told Margaret. "Since Eleanor died, the ranch has sometimes been short of things. I've tried to help where I could." "That's very thoughtful," Margaret said. "It's a hard life out here for a woman alone." She said it gently, carefully, not cruel, just certain as if she were offering a fact that Margaret might not have fully absorbed yet. Even with help. Tom was standing near the door in the way he had of being present in a room without quite committing to it. Margaret glanced at him and found him looking at the floor with the focused non-expression of a man who has learned to be somewhere else in his head when a social situation requires it. She almost felt sorry for him, almost. "Would you like some coffee, Mrs. Whitmore?" Margaret said. "I'd love some," Claricor said warmly. She sat down at the table at the seat that Eli used for his schoolwork, which was somehow subtly the wrong seat, and settled in with the ease of a woman accustomed to making herself comfortable in other people's kitchens. She stayed for 2 hours. In those 2 hours, she was warm, engaging, helpful, and completely impenetrable. She talked about the town, about the winter, about mutual acquaintances whom Margaret did not yet have. She talked about Eleanor Callahan with a carefully calibrated wistfulness that conveyed both fond memory and gentle implication. She was so well suited to this life, she understood it so well in a way that required no direct comparison to be perfectly clear. She addressed Tom in the slightly softened voice of a woman who has decided someone belongs to her in theory, even if she hasn't gotten around to establishing it in practice. She was, Margaret thought, watching over her coffee cup, completely and ruthlessly accomplished at the specific art of being exactly what a man might want in the way that a stage set is exactly what the scene requires, beautifully constructed, perfectly positioned, and without anything behind it that you weren't supposed to see. Tom was polite to her with the slightly burdened politeness of a man who has accepted an obligation he can't quite remember incurring. When she finally left, pressing Tom's hand briefly at the door in a way that was warm without being quite improper, Margaret watched from the kitchen window as the buggy rolled out of the yard. Tom came back inside and poured himself more coffee and stood at the window too. "She comes by often?" Margaret asked. "Often enough," he said. It didn't quite answer the question. "She was very kind to bring things." "She's always been kind," he said. There was something in the way he said it, a flatness that was not quite neutrality. He drank his coffee. He looked at the yard. He said without looking at her, "She meant well. After Eleanor died, people meant well." Margaret understood from the way he said it that meaning well had been its own kind of burden, that the ranch had been full in those first months of people meaning well in ways that required him to perform grief correctly, to respond to the kindness appropriately, to be somewhere between devastated and functional, in a proportion that satisfied other people's need to feel they had helped. "People do that," she said. "Yes," he said. They stood at the kitchen window for a moment in silence. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the east and the cold was coming down off the mountains in the particular swift, clean way it did at this hour. "Supper in an hour," she said. "I'll be in," he said, and went back outside. She watched him cross the dark yard toward the barn, and she thought about what he had said that morning in the second week almost to himself when he'd come into the kitchen and found that she had reorganized everything and improved on what was already there. "You're not what I expected, but maybe that's not a bad thing." She held that sentence like a coin she wasn't sure she could spend. It was Hank who told her about Eleanor Callahan. Not deliberately, not as information. It came out the way things come out around a warm kitchen table on a cold December evening when the wind is up outside and the coffee is good, and the person listening is the kind of person who makes you want to keep talking. "She was a fine woman," Hank said. "Different from Tom. Lighter, if you follow me. Tom's always been," he gestured vaguely with his coffee cup, "the way he is, but Eleanor could make him laugh, genuinely laugh, which is something you don't see often." "How long were they married?" Margaret asked. 12 years. Eli was born their second year out here." He was quiet for a moment. "She died in the spring before last. Fever that went into her lungs. Went fast, that's one mercy, I suppose." "That's a hard thing," Margaret said. "It broke something in him," Hank said, simply without drama. Not broke like he stopped working or stopped caring for Eli or stopped running the ranch. He never stopped any of that. But there's a difference between a man who's living and a man who's working, and Tom's been doing a lot more of the second than the first." He stared at the table for a moment. "The advertisement that was his brother's idea. Daniel was the optimistic one. Always thought Tom needed to be shaken out of himself, pushed toward things. He placed it before he died and never told Tom, far as I know. Tom found it in Daniel's papers, and Hank shook his head. I think he kept it because he couldn't decide whether Daniel was right. Margaret looked at her coffee. She thought about a man keeping a dead brother's advertisement because he couldn't decide whether the dead brother was right. She thought about how that felt, probably the specific grief of not knowing whether to believe the last hopeful thing someone had done before they died. He's a good man, Hank said. Stubborn and private and more complicated than he looks, but good. I know, Margaret said. Hank looked at her. Do you? I think so, she said. I'm still learning. He nodded, satisfied with that. He picked up his coffee and drank it and didn't say anything else, and the wind moved through the eaves of the old house with a sound like breathing, and the kitchen was warm, and somewhere upstairs Eli was doing his sums with the light that came down from his window in a yellow square across the frozen yard. Margaret thought, I am beginning to understand this place. Not all of it, not near all of it, but enough to know that it was worth understanding and that there was more here than she'd allowed herself to hope for back in the dark and cold of a Boston morning when she had unfolded an advertisement and made the reckless, necessary, terrifying decision to try it on. She heard the words 3 days before Christmas. She had gone into town for supplies. Tom had given her the wagon, and Hank had driven her, which she understood was a practical arrangement and not a statement about her driving ability, though she'd grown up in a city and had no particular experience with wagon horses. They had done the shopping efficiently, loading the supplies in the cold, and she had sent Hank to collect the feed sacks from the mill, while she stopped in the dry goods store for a few more items. The door between the store proper and the back room was open. She had not noticed until she heard her own name. It was Claire's voice, low and amused and confiding in a way that was clearly intended for an audience of two. Poor Tom, she was saying. He's doing his best with a difficult situation. The woman means well, I'm sure, but you've seen her. What kind of life is that for a man like him? He'll spend a winter being polite and then write her a check and send her back to wherever she came from, and that'll be the end of it. A murmur from the other woman, the storekeeper's wife, Margaret, thought. He'll never truly love someone like her, Claire said pleasantly, as if she were discussing the weather. You know Tom. He's a man of standards, even if he doesn't always show it. She's a good cook, apparently, but that's, well, a light laugh. That's not a marriage. That's a housekeeper. Margaret stood very still. She felt the words settle over her, the way cold settles not all at once, but gradually finding every gap. He'll never truly love someone like her. She had told herself these weeks not to want that. She had been very careful and very disciplined and very clear with herself about what she was here for and what she was not going to be foolish enough to expect. She had been so careful. The words still landed. She waited until her breathing was entirely even. She picked up her items from the shelf she'd been examining. She went to the counter and paid for them. She said good morning to the storekeeper's wife, who had the grace to look at the floor. She walked out of the store and stood on the frozen boardwalk in the December air and looked at the street of Harlow Creek. Hank came around the corner with the wagon. Ready, he said. Yes, said Margaret Doyle. Let's go home. She said the word home without thinking about it. She noticed on the way back that she had said it. She turned it over in her mind for the 7 miles between town and the ranch and let it settle where it settled. Whatever Claire Whitmore believed about what was possible, whatever the world had always told Margaret about what she deserved, she was not going back to Boston. She was not going back to a pull-out sofa and a kitchen that wasn't hers and 30 minutes stolen in the morning as her only portion of a life. She had come 2,000 miles on a train with $23 and a recipe book, and she had made something here, something warm and real, and hers and no one, not Claire Whitmore, with her fine features and her calculated certainties. Not anyone was going to tell her that it wasn't enough. She held that thought all the way back to the Iron Fork. She went inside and made the best supper she had made in weeks. Tom ate it in silence, the way he always did. At the end of the meal, he looked up from his plate and looked at her directly, the full unguarded look she had learned to recognize as his most honest, the one that appeared rarely and without warning, and said, "Whatever happened today, you all right?" Margaret looked at him. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her a moment longer, the way a man looks at something he is not quite satisfied is true, but doesn't know how to contradict. Then he nodded and went to bed. She washed the dishes alone in the kitchen with the wind outside and the lamp warm above the table, and the dried wildflowers in the jar on the windowsill. The wildflowers he had put there she had learned in the days before she arrived and had never mentioned. She washed the dishes and thought about what it meant that he had put flowers in her room. She thought about it for a long time. Part 3, Secrets Beneath the Dust. Christmas came to the Iron Fork quietly, the way all things came there, without ceremony, without announcement, in the way of a place that had learned to receive what arrived and ask little about the form it took. Margaret had never celebrated Christmas in any particular style. Her childhood Christmases had been her mother's cooking and her father's absence, and Helen's careful cataloging of what they had and didn't have, measured against other families. In Boston on Corwin Street, Christmas had meant extra work for the same pay and a small turkey that went further than it should have because Helen was good at stretching things. At the Iron Fork, she decided to do something different. She spent 3 days building up to it quietly without making a production of it because she had learned that at this ranch productions were not welcome and quiet steadiness was. She found pine boughs in the woods at the edge of the property, hauled back by Hank without complaint, when she asked and arranged them along the mantel and the windowsills and over the kitchen door. She made a wreath from the same boughs and wire from the barn because she had her mother's hands, practical, inventive, able to make something from available materials. She baked 3 kinds of cookie and a fruitcake and a proper mince pie. She made a standing rib roast for Christmas dinner from the best beef the ranch had seasoned, the way her mother had shown her, cooked low and slow in the range until it was perfect. On Christmas morning, she made hot chocolate and put it on the table with the cookies before anyone was fully awake. Eli came downstairs in his long underwear and stopped at the kitchen doorway. His eyes moved from the pine boughs to the cookies to the chocolate to Margaret, who was standing at the range in her apron with her hair not yet properly up, and something moved across his face that was too quick and too complicated to name. He sat down at the table without a word. He picked up the mug of chocolate. "My mother used to make this," he said, very quietly. He wasn't looking at her. Margaret did not say anything immediately. She turned back to the range and gave him a moment with that. "My mother used to make it too," she said finally. "Different recipe, I imagine, but the same idea." A pause. "How do you make yours?" he asked. She told him. He listened with the focused, serious attention that she had come to realize was simply his way. Eli Callahan did not do anything halfway, did not listen halfway, did not think halfway. He was in this, as in most things, his father's son. "You could learn it," she said, "if you wanted." He looked at his chocolate. "Maybe," he said. Tom appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, stopped at the sight of the pine boughs in the decorated kitchen, and stood for a moment in the doorway with his hat in his hands and an expression she had no category for, something open and unguarded that she suspected he didn't know was showing. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Callahan," she said. He looked at her. "Merry Christmas, Miss Doyle," he said. He came in and poured his coffee and sat at the table beside his son, and the 3 of them were quiet in the decorated kitchen while the ranch slept outside and the snow on the mountains caught the early light, and it was, Margaret thought, the most domestic moment she had experienced in 6 years, the most genuinely homelike. She let herself feel it, carefully, the way you allow yourself to feel something good when you have been afraid of wanting good things, with gratitude and without grasping, holding it lightly in case it needed to be let go. January deepened and brought with it the particular cabin fever of a Montana winter. Not the romance of it, but the practical, grinding reality. The cold that made every task twice as hard. The shortened days, the close quarters. The way that small irritations became large ones when there was nowhere to go and nothing to do but work and endure. Margaret endured it the way she endured most things, by making herself useful, by staying busy, by directing her attention outward when her inner weather was difficult. She also read. Tom had a small library in the room off the parlor that he called the study, though it was really just a room with a desk and 3 shelves of books, most of them practical, animal husbandry, land, surveying, 2 law books, some history, and a small collection of novels that she suspected had belonged to Eleanor. She had asked carefully in the 2nd month whether she might borrow from the shelf, and he had said yes, in the brief way he said yes to things, and she had understood from the way he said it that Eleanor's novels were among the things he had not yet decided what to do with, not to be removed, not to be distributed, just to be left where they were until he knew. She read them slowly and returned each one exactly to its place. It was in the study on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of January that she found the letter. She had not been looking for it. She had been returning a novel to the shelf and had misjudged the space, and the book had pushed a small wooden box off the back of the shelf, and the box had opened when it hit the floor, and the letter inside had slid out. She picked it up. She meant only to put it back, but her eyes caught her own name, Miss Margaret Doyle, in Tom's unpracticed handwriting, unaddressed, unsealed, never sent. She stood with the letter in her hands for a longer moment. The right thing was to put it back unread. So she knew that. She put it back. She went back to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window for 10 minutes. Then she went back and read it. Miss Doyle, I am writing this because my brother told me before he died that I should answer whoever wrote back. I have tried to write it 4 times and thrown it out 4 times. Here is the 5th attempt. I don't know what I have to offer a woman. I know what the ranch has to offer: work, land shelter, a fair wage. That's what I can guarantee. The rest I can't. She was a good woman, the best I knew. After she died, I stopped looking at things the same way. Not deliberately, I just stopped. The world got smaller. I don't know if that's permanent. What I know is this: Daniel thought I needed to try. He was almost always right about things, even the things I didn't want to hear. I'm keeping the advertisement because I can't decide if he's right this time too. Whoever you are, if you're willing to try a place that asks a great deal and gives back quietly, I hope you're kind. That's all I ever really needed when I think about it. Just kindness. I don't know how to ask or should better than that. Thomas Callahan. She stood in the study with the letter in her hands and her throat closed around something she had no name for. I hope you're kind. That's all I ever really needed. He had written this, written it and never sent it, kept it in a box on a shelf with the books he couldn't yet touch. She put it back exactly as she had found it. She left the study and closed the door. She went upstairs and sat on her bed with her mother's quilt around her shoulders in the January cold, and she let herself feel fully and without discipline everything she had been keeping carefully contained since the first morning she had stood on that frozen platform and met his eyes. He was not cold. He was not closed. He was a man who had lost the person who made him laugh and his brother in the same 2 years, and he was carrying it the way you carry things that are too heavy, bent slightly forward without stopping. She did not say anything to him that day or that week, but something shifted in the careful architecture of how she carried herself around him, some small structural change. She didn't consciously authorize a slight lowering of the careful guard she'd kept since Boston, a slight opening in the direction of what was actually true instead of what was safe to want. The strangers came in the second week of February. There were 4 of them. She saw them from the kitchen window on a cold Wednesday morning, riding into the yard in the way that communicated nothing good, too slowly, too deliberately, in the spread formation of men who are not afraid of what they'll find because they've already decided what they're going to do. Tom was in the yard. She saw him go still at the sight of the horses. She could not hear the conversation from the kitchen, but she saw the shape of it in his body, the way his shoulders went flat and square, the way his jaw set, the way his hands found his coat pockets and stayed there. She saw him shake his head once. She saw the man at the front of the group, broad, dark-coated, with something in his posture that she recognized even from a distance as the posture of a man who was accustomed to being the most dangerous person present, lean forward in his saddle and say something else. Tom said something back. The man sat back, nodded slowly with the particular nod of someone filing information away for later use. The 4 men rode back out of the yard. Tom stood in the yard for a long moment after they left. Then he turned and walked toward the barn, and his face when he passed the kitchen window was the face she had not seen before, closed in a different way than his usual self-containment, closed the way a door is closed against something pressing from the other side. That evening at supper, he was silent in a way that was distinct from his ordinary silence. Eli noticed she could see from across the table that the boy was tracking his father with the alert, careful attention of a child who has learned to read his parents' weather. After Eli went to bed, she was washing dishes when Tom came into the kitchen. "Who were those men?" she said. She did not preface it or soften it. She had learned that he responded better to directness than to approach. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Men who want land. This land. Part of it. The east parcel where the good grass runs. They've made offers before." She waited. He moved to the window and looked out at the dark yard. "They're not the kind who only make offers," she said. A pause. "No," he said. "Have you spoken to anyone the law in Harlow Creek?" Something crossed his face, not quite cynicism, but in the neighborhood of it. "The law in Harlow Creek has its own relationships," he said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. "Is there more?" she asked. He looked at her then, the full direct look. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you're carrying something heavier than a land dispute," she said. "You've been carrying it since I arrived. Maybe longer." The silence stretched. "Eleanor," he said finally, very quietly, "the way she died." There were people who said he stopped, started again more carefully. "There was a man who came to the ranch 2 weeks before she got sick. He and I had words about the east parcel. She was in the yard when it happened. She heard things, and then she got sick." Margaret set down the dish she was drying, very carefully. "You think the fever wasn't natural?" He looked at the window. "I don't know what I think. I have no proof. I had nothing but a feeling, and feelings aren't evidence. And the sheriff at the time was—" He stopped. "He retired the following year with money I don't know where he got." She let that sit for a moment. "You've been waiting," she said, "for them to come back." "I've been watching," he said. "There's a difference." She thought about that. She thought about a man sitting alone in a study, writing a letter he never sent, keeping a dead brother's advertisement, running a ranch in the long shadow of suspicion and grief that he couldn't prove and couldn't let go of. She thought about what it cost to carry on all of that alone for 2 years with only the work to anchor you. "You asked for honesty," she said, "but you never gave me yours." He looked at her. It landed. She could see it land, could see the slight flinch of it, the recognition. "No," he said, "I didn't." The kitchen was quiet. The lamp threw its warm circle over the table between them, and outside the Montana dark pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and was answered. "I'm telling you now," he said. "I know," she said. "I appreciate it." He stood at the window for another moment. Then before he left, he said the thing she had not expected and had no defense against. "I'm glad you came, Miss Doyle. I didn't know I would be, but I am." He went out. She heard his boots on the stairs. She stood at the kitchen sink with the dish still in her hands, and her heart doing something it had not done in a very long time, something unguarded and terrifying, and in its way wonderful. She found the second thing 3 days later. She had been down to the cellar for preserves and had taken the wrong turn in the dark, ending up in a part of the cellar she hadn't been to before, a backroom lower and colder with old trunks and crates and the accumulated weight of the ranch's history stacked against the stone walls. She was about to turn back when the lamplight caught the corner of something, a crate newer than the others, with the lid not quite sealed. She moved the lamp closer. The lid tilted open under the weight of the lamp. Inside, beneath a layer of oilcloth, were papers. She would have left them alone. She would have, she told herself later, left them completely alone, except that the top sheet had a name on it. She recognized the same name from the deed that hung in Tom's study, the name of the east parcel, and below it a second name, not Tom's, not the stranger's, a name that stopped her cold. A name she had heard very recently in a different context entirely. She stood in the cellar for a long time, the lamp tilting slowly in her hand. Then she put everything back exactly as she had found. It went upstairs and sat at the kitchen table and thought very hard about what she had just seen and what it meant. Because the name at the bottom of that document, beneath the deed transfer, beside a date from 18 months ago, in the precise signature of someone who knew what they were signing and why was not a stranger's name. It was a name she knew. And the knowledge of it changed everything she thought she had understood about the danger coming toward the Iron Fork Ranch. Part 4. Betrayal, Fire, and Truth. She did not tell Tom immediately. This was a decision she made deliberately and with full understanding that it might be wrong. She spent 2 days thinking it through, turning the document over in her mind, the names, the date, the nature of what she had seen, and what it implied, and whether what it implied was actually what was there, or whether she was building a structure from insufficient material, which was the kind of thinking that caused damage. She was not the kind of person who built structures from insufficient material. She checked her work. So she went back to the cellar twice and then looked again. She was careful and thorough. She read every page of what was in the crate in the cold lamplight, crouching on the cellar floor with her skirts tucked under her. What she found was this: 18 months ago, approximately 4 months before Eleanor Callahan died, a partial deed transfer had been drawn up for the Iron Forks East parcel, transferring a 20% share to a land speculation company whose letterhead bore an address in Helena. The deed bore two signatures. One was a signature she did not recognize. The other was not Tom's signature, but it was someone who had access to the ranch. Someone who had been here in this house regularly enough to know where documents were kept and how the ranch's business was conducted. The second signature was Claire Whitmore's. She sat with that for a long time in the coal cellar. Claire, who had been coming to the ranch since Eleanor died. Claire, who kept her eyes on Tom and her manner warm and her calculations invisible. Claire, who had said in the back room of the Mercantile, "He'll never truly love someone like her." Not only as a dismissal of Margaret, but as a statement of certainty about Tom's future that went beyond the confidence of a woman who admired him. The certainty of a woman who had plans. On the third day, Margaret went to Tom. She found him in the barn in the late afternoon, mending tack by lantern light, a task he clearly found calming, the way some people find repetitive work, calming the hands occupied and the mind quieter. She closed the barn door behind her and came to stand near him. He looked up. She said, "I need to show you something." His expression shifted, not alarm, but attention. The particular attention of a man who has been waiting for the other shoe to drop for some time. She told him what she had found in the cellar. She told him clearly, completely, in the order she had found it, and without embellishment, because embellishment was not what this required. She told him about the crate, the oilcloth, the papers, the deed, the two signatures. He stopped working the tack before she finished. When she stopped speaking, the barn was very quiet, except for the horses moving in their stalls and the wind against the boards. He said very carefully, "Say that name again." She said it. He put down the tack. He stood up from the crate he'd been sitting on, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man controlling something that wants very much to move fast. He said nothing for a long moment. "She's been in this house," he said. Not a question. "Yes. She's been in this house since Eleanor." His voice was flat and strange. "She knew where things were. She knew the study, the cellar. Eleanor trusted her. I trusted her. He stopped. Margaret waited. "Eleanor was in the yard that day," he said. "When the man came about the land, Eleanor heard what was said." He looked at the barn wall. "Claire was with her, in the yard. She was here that afternoon." The silence that followed had a different weight than any that had come before it. Margaret said quietly, "You need to take those papers somewhere safe, and you need to talk to someone in the law who isn't local." He looked at her. "The county sheriff in Billings. He's not a man who can be bought. I know him from before." "Can you ride out tomorrow?" "I'll go tonight," he said. "Eli. Eli stays. Hank will watch him." He moved toward the barn door, then stopped. He turned and looked at her and said, with an honesty that cost him something, "I should have told you everything sooner. I knew you were someone who could be told. I hadn't decided to trust anyone yet." "You trust people by deciding to," Margaret said. "There's no other way." He looked at her for a moment, that look again, the open, unguarded one, and said, "Yes, I'm beginning to understand that." He went to the house. 20 minutes later, he was saddled and riding out into the dark, the papers in his saddlebag, heading north toward Billings. She watched him go from the porch. Then she went inside and sat with Eli, who was doing his sums, and did not ask where his father had gone, because he knew she understood now not to ask questions that his father might not want to answer. She helped him with a long division problem that was giving him trouble, and told him to go to bed at his usual time, and did not let him see in her face that anything was different. After he went up, she sat in the kitchen with the lamp and her recipe book, and she wrote nothing. She just sat and listened to the house and waited. Tom came back the following evening, later than she had expected. He came in the back door with the particular look of a man who has been riding hard and has not slept and has set something in motion that cannot be stopped. "It's done," he said. "The county sheriff has the documents. He knows the names. He'll be here within the week. And Claire, she doesn't know he's coming." He poured water from the pitcher and drank it standing at the sink. "There are two men connected to the land company who have warrants outstanding in two other counties. The sheriff has been looking for a thread to pull. This is the thread." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. How did you find those papers? He said. The cellar, nobody's been in that back room in years. I took the wrong turn in the dark, she said, and then I took the right one. The corner of his mouth moved. She was beginning to know the exact geography of that movement, the degree to which it appeared, the specific things that caused it. It was not quite a smile. It was better than a smile because it was unguarded. She had 4 days. In those 4 days, the ranch ran as it always ran. She cooked and organized and helped Eli with his schoolwork and managed the kitchen and did not tell anyone what she knew. She watched from her peripheral vision the road from town, and she thought about the name on the deed and the woman who had signed it, and she was afraid in the particular way that you are afraid when you understand that a thing is moving toward you and you don't know its exact shape. Claire Whitmore came to the Iron Fork on the 4th day. She came in the afternoon earlier than usual without her father's hired man. She drove herself in the small buggy, arriving in the yard with the kind of purpose in her bearing that was distinguishable to anyone paying attention from her usual social call purposefulness. Margaret was hanging washing on the line in the yard when the buggy came in, and she saw as Claire stepped down that something was different. Claire's eyes went to her immediately. They were measuring, calculating in a way that was stripped of its usual social warmth, like the warmth was a garment she had forgotten to put on, and she didn't have time to go back for it. Is Tom here? She said. He's out on the south fence, Margaret had said. I need to speak with him. I can get a message to him when he comes in. Claire looked at her. There was a pause that lasted about 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Margaret watched the woman in front of her make a calculation, saw it happen in the small, rapid adjustments of her expression. I know you found something, Claire said, quietly, without the warmth, without the pleasantness, with only the direct, cold precision of someone who has decided prudence is no longer useful. I don't know what exactly, but I know Tom went to Billings. Margaret kept her hands on the washing. Is that Tom? Whatever you think you found, you don't understand the full picture, Claire said. Her voice was steady, reasonable, the voice of a woman accustomed to being persuasive. The land company made an arrangement with people who had interest in this property going back 10 years. Eleanor understood that. She stopped. Eleanor was going to be reasonable about it. Something cold moved through Margaret's chest. Eleanor was going to be reasonable, she said, very quietly. These things are complicated, Claire said. Tom can't hold on to this land alone. He never could. It was always going to require— Stop, Margaret said. She said it the way she said things that needed to be heard clearly, without heat, with the full weight of her attention behind it. Claire stopped. Margaret looked at her, at the fine-boned face, the careful hair, the coat that fit perfectly. Eleanor didn't die of fever, she said. It was not a question. Claire's face did not change. That was the answer. I want you to leave this property, Margaret said, and I want you to understand that what you just told me, I will repeat every word of it to the county sheriff when he arrives. Claire looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her eyes that was not calculable, not controlled, something close to but not quite fear. You have no idea, she said. What kind of people are involved in this? I have some idea, Margaret said, and I'm not leaving. Claire got back in her buggy. She drove out of the yard with the same controlled purpose with which she'd arrived, and Margaret watched her go and then turned and walked quickly to the bunkhouse to send Hank for Tom, because she understood with the absolute certainty of a woman who had spent her life reading rooms and situations in the spaces between what people said and what they meant, that things were about to move very fast. They came that night, 3 of them, the same men from before -1, arriving after midnight when the ranch was dark and quiet, or appeared dark and quiet. Tom had been warned. He and Hank and 2 of the other hands were in the barn when the horses came into the yard, and Margaret had been told to take Eli and go to the root cellar, which she had done, and was now sitting in the dark underground with his father's son pressed against her side and her hand covering his where it gripped her sleeve. Is Pa going to be all right? Eli whispered. Your father is very capable, she said, and he's prepared. Are you scared? She considered this. A little, she said. That's all right. Being scared just means you're paying attention. She felt him breathe beside her, felt him processing that the way he processed arithmetic seriously, completely. Okay, he said. Above them, the yard erupted. She could hear it through the root cellar door, shouting the crack of a shot, horses more shouting. She held Eli still and quiet the way she would have held Button during a storm, not telling him not to be afraid, just being the solid thing in the dark that he could press against. And then she smelled smoke. She smelled it before she heard it, the specific, immediately alarming smell of something burning that should not be burning, the kind of smell that overrides every other consideration. The bunkhouse. She could hear it now, the particular sound of fire finding purchase in old dry wood, the crack and then the roar of it. She could hear voices, Tom's voice, authoritative and clear, directing the hands. She could hear the sounds of the fight changing, moving. She made a decision. "Lie," she said. "Stay here. Do not come out unless I come back for you. Do you understand me?" "Margaret, do you understand me?" A beat. "Yes," he said. She came out of the root cellar into the smoke-edged dark. The bunkhouse was burning at its far end, not yet fully involved, but moving fast, the fire eating the dry November wood with an efficiency that terrified her. In the yard, two of the strangers were unhorsed, and the third was fighting with Hank near the barn door. She couldn't see Tom. She saw the water trough. She saw the bucket line that Tom and the hands had already started, Hank breaking from the fight to get to the line, the other hands working the pump. She went to the pump. She pumped. She did not stop pumping. She heard Tom's voice behind her. "Margaret," the particular urgency in it. She turned. The third man had gotten past Hank and was between Tom and the burning bunkhouse, and he had a gun, and he was raising it, and Tom was 5 feet away with his own gun already out. She grabbed the bucket she had just filled and threw it, not at the man. At the burning wall behind him, a wall of fire that billowed out when the water hit it, a blast of steam and smoke that made the man flinch and turn, and in that half-second, Tom moved. She did not watch what happened next. She went back to the pump. She pumped until her arms gave out, and then she pumped more. When it was over, when the fire was out, and the men were restrained, and Tom's voice was telling the hands to tie them and hold them until the sheriff arrived, she was still at the pump, her skirts blackened at the hem, her arms shaking, her face wet with exertion in the heat of the fire. Tom came to her. He came to her through the smoke-hazed yard, and he stood in front of her, and he looked at her. Not the measuring look from the platform, not the recalibrating look from the kitchen, but something she had not seen before, something open and undefended in a way his face almost never permitted. "Eli," she said immediately. "Hank has him. He's fine." His hands came up to her arms, steadying her as her legs decided they had done enough for one evening. "You came out of the cellar. The smoke. You came out," he said. "You could have stayed." "I could have," she said. "I chose not to." He looked at her for a long moment in the smoky dark, his hands still on her arms, holding her upright in the way of a man who is not sure whether he is steadying someone else or himself. "I didn't choose you at first," he said. "I need you to know that. When your letter came, I didn't choose. I just honored what Daniel started. I wasn't ready to choose." "I know," she said. But now, his voice stopped, started again. "Now I can't imagine a life here without you. Not the cooking or the kitchen or any of the practical things. I can't imagine it." She looked at him, at the weathered face, the gray at his temples, the creek water eyes that were right now entirely unguarded. "You don't have to imagine it," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Something moved through him that she felt in her arms where his hands held them, a long, slow release of tension that had been held so long it had probably stopped registering as tension. Behind them, Eli's voice said, "Margaret." She turned. He was standing at the yard's edge with Hank's hand on his shoulder, his hair wild, his eyes going rapidly between his father and the smoking bunkhouse and Margaret. "You came out," he said. "I heard you. You said you'd come back." "I came back," she said. "Come here." He came across the yard and she put her arms around him, and he let her fully, without reservation, without the careful, managed distance of the past months, and she held him in the smoky dark and felt him shaking with the adrenaline of it and held him until he stopped. Over his head, she looked at Tom. Tom looked at his son in her arms and at her face above his son's head, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Not happiness exactly, because happiness was too light a word for it. It was something older and more durable than happiness. Something that had come through a great deal of difficulty to arrive at itself and knew it and was not taking it lightly. Part 5. A Love That Was Never Ordered. The county sheriff arrived from Billings the following morning with 2 deputies in the Iron Fork Ranch spent the next several hours in the organized chaos of formal inquiry, depositions taken in Tom's study, the three arrested men taken into custody, evidence collected from the root cellar crate, with a careful thoroughness that told Margaret the sheriff had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening for longer than Tom had known. She cooked through all of it. She made breakfast for the deputies and the hands in Eli and Tom, and she made coffee in quantities that required 2 pots, and she kept the kitchen running in the steady, purposeful way that was her particular genius, not invisible exactly, but unobtrusive enough that the men who needed to talk could talk, and those who needed to eat could eat, and the center of the operation could hold while everything else was sorted out around it. The sheriff was a compact, methodical man named Aldrich who had the watchful eyes of someone who had spent 30 years learning to distinguish between what people showed and what they knew. He ate 2 biscuits with his coffee and looked at Margaret over the rim of his cup with an expression that was not quite a question. "You found the papers," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you told Callahan?" "Yes." "And before that, when the Whittemore woman came the day of the fire, you spoke with her directly?" "I did." He looked at her steadily. "That was not the safest choice." "I'm aware of that," she said, "but the alternative was to let her warn the others before you arrived. That seemed worse." Aldrich regarded her for a moment. "You're not from here," he said. "Boston," she said. "Originally." He said in a tone that might have been appreciation or might have been reservation. He ate his second biscuit. "You'll need to give a formal statement." "I know," she said. "I'll give you one that's accurate and complete." He looked at her again, and this time the expression was, she thought, closer to respect. "I expect you will," he said. The truth, when it came out fully in the weeks that followed, was worse and cleaner than Margaret had allowed herself to imagine. Claire Whitmore had not been the architect of the scheme. She had been in the particular way of certain capable and desperate women, an instrument of it recruited by the land speculation company's man in Helena, 2 years before Eleanor died, promised money and a stake in the East Parcel's future revenues, and tasked with providing access to the ranch's documents, to the household's rhythms, to the people who could be maneuvered. Eleanor Callahan had not died of a natural fever. The investigation confirmed what Tom had feared, and could not prove the water source at the east corner, the one Eleanor had walked to the morning she got sick, had been contaminated. Not accidentally. The same man who had come to the ranch 2 weeks before Eleanor died had come back after dark. Claire had left the gate unlocked. The evidence was old, and some of it was circumstantial, and the full weight of the law moved in its slow and imperfect way, but it moved. 3 men were charged. Claire Whitmore, facing the alternative, cooperated fully with the county prosecutor, and in doing so implicated the man in Helena who had run the scheme, and he was charged with crimes that would keep him in a federal prison for the better part of the next decade. The East Parcel deed fraud was voided. The Iron Fork Ranch was clear. Tom received this news on a cold February afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table, the official letter from the county prosecutor in his hands, and he read it twice and then set it down on the table and sat for a long time without speaking. Margaret was at the range. She did not ask him what it said. She waited because he would tell her when he was ready. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. "Eleanor." He stopped, started again. Knowing what happened to her, it's not easy. But not knowing was worse. She came to the table and sat across from him, the way she had sat across from him at dozens of meals in the winter light that came through the kitchen window. "She would have wanted you to know," she said, "so you could let it go." He looked at the letter. "I don't know how to let it go yet." "You don't have to know yet," she said. "You just have to start." He looked at her, then the full, direct, undefended look that she had learned over these months was the most honest thing about him. He said, "You're very good at that." "At what?" "At saying the right amount of a thing." He looked at her the way he had looked at her through the smoke in the yard. "Eleanor used to say I needed someone who would meet me where I was not where they thought I should be. She said I was always slightly ahead of people or behind them, and I needed someone who could find the same step." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I think Eleanor was a very perceptive woman," she said. "She was." He looked at the window. "I think she would have liked you." It was, she thought, the most generous thing he could have given her. Spring came to the Iron Fork in the particular violent beauty of a Montana spring, the snow retreating up the mountain faces while the ground below was still frozen, the creek running high and cold and fast with the melt, the grass coming up in the muddy margins of the yard in a green so sharp it almost hurt to look at. The bunkhouse had been rebuilt before winter's worst, the hands working with the focused collective energy of people who understand that their shelter is their livelihood. By the time the snow began to melt, it was solid and weather-tight, and the ranch had returned to its rhythms altered by what had happened but not broken by it. Margaret had begun in the early spring to teach Eli to cook. This was his suggestion, not hers. He had come to her one Saturday morning in March and said with the directness that was his most distinctive trait, "Will you show me how to make the hot chocolate properly?" And she had said yes, and they had spent an hour at the range with the cocoa and the cream, and something about that hour, the close, warm, purposeful work of it, had opened a door that had been standing mostly shut for months. After the hot chocolate, it was the biscuits, then the gravy, then tentatively the apple pie, which was more complicated and required two failed attempts before Eli's jaw set in the particular way that meant he had decided to conquer this thing, which was so exactly his father's expression that Margaret had to look at the ceiling for a moment. He mastered the apple pie on the third trip. Tom came into the kitchen while the pie was cooling on the windowsill and stopped at the smell of it. He looked from the pie to Eli to Margaret with an expression she was learning to read as his version of delight, a warm, restrained, entirely genuine thing. "I made it," Eli said. He was trying not to sound proud. He was not succeeding. Tom looked at the pea, then at his son, then briefly at Margaret. "It looks right," he said in a voice that was not quite neutral. "It smells better than right," Margaret said. They had the pie at supper, all three of them, and the hands and Hank pronounced it the second best apple pie he'd had on the property, which was Margaret had long since understood the highest compliment Hank was constitutionally capable of offering about anyone's cooking other than hers. Eli sat very straight at the table and accepted this with great dignity. It was on an April evening, with the last of the day's light going gold over the West Ridge, and the kitchen smelling of wood smoke and bread, and the particular warm complexity of a house that has become a home, that Tom asked her to walk with him. She had never been asked to walk with him before. He was not a man who asked for company directly. He was a man who created conditions under which company was possible and let the other person decide. The directness of the question startled her enough that she said yes, for she had quite thought it through, which she later decided was probably the point. They walked out past the barn, past the hay field to the east fence, the line of the property that had been contested and was no longer contested, that had cost them what it had cost them and was now clear. The fence posts ran away to the north in a line so straight it looked deliberate, and beyond them, the good grass of the east parcel ran down to the creek already greening. Tom walked beside her with his hands in his coat pockets and the last light on his face. He said, "I've been thinking about a thing and I don't know the right way to say it." "You usually don't start with warnings when you're going to say something," she said. "You usually just say it." The corner of his mouth. "I do, don't I?" He stopped at the fence. He looked out over the east pasture for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I kept that letter," he said. "The one Daniel wrote, the advertisement. I kept it because I couldn't decide if he was right, if trying again was the right thing. And then your letter came, and I couldn't not answer it because it was the most honest thing I'd read in 2 years, and honesty was—" He stopped. Honesty was what I needed to remember was possible. She said nothing. She waited. "You came here," he said, "and you made this place into—" He looked at the house, the barn, the rebuilt bunkhouse, the kitchen light visible through the far window. "Into something I wanted to come home to. Not just a place I was obligated to maintain. Something I wanted." "That was the cooking," she said. "It was not the cooking," he said, and the directness of it, the flat certainty stopped her. He turned to face her. "I want to ask you to stay," he said, not the arrangement we started with, as my wife, properly, because I want you here. Not out of obligation or practicality. I want you here." The last light was doing something extraordinary to the east pasture, turning the young grass gold, throwing the creek's surface into silver, making the whole long landscape into something almost unbearably beautiful. Margaret looked at Thomas Callahan, at the gray temples and the weathered face and the creek water eyes that were right now as undefended as she had ever seen them. She thought about a letter falling out of a library book on a Tuesday morning in Boston. She thought about a woman who had been told her whole life that she was not enough Too much of some things, not enough of others, sitting at a kitchen table in October with a butter knife and 2 sheets of correspondence paper making the terrifying, necessary right decision. She thought about $23.40 in a recipe book and a mother's quilt. She thought about what it meant to be chosen. Not for your face, not for your figure, not for the currency that the world decided women were worth. For your words on a page, honest and plain, reaching across a continent to a man who had asked for honesty and found it. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and what moved across his face in that moment was not theatrical and was not small. It was the specific, quiet, enormous relief of a man who has been afraid for a long time and has just been given a reason to stop. He took her hand. He held it in the practical, certain grip of a man who holds things he intends to keep. They stood at the east fence in the last of the April light, the two of them, and said nothing more for a while, because nothing more needed to be said. They were married in June. Not in the town church. Tom was not a church man, and Margaret had made her peace with that, but in the yard of the Iron Fork on a Saturday afternoon when the sky was the impossible blue that the Montana summer produced without apology, and the east pasture was full green behind the fence, and the creek ran clear and fast in the distance. Hank had cleaned his good coat for the occasion. The hands had built a long table in the yard, and Margaret had cooked for 3 days beforehand, not because she had to, but because cooking was how she loved, and she was not going to apologize for that on her wedding day. There was beef, and there were biscuits, and there were 4 pushes and a layer cake that Eli had helped her make standing at the range with his father's jaw set in the expression of someone who has decided to master this. The judge came from Harlow Creek and read the words, and Tom said yes in the flat, certain way he said everything that mattered, and Margaret said yes in the voice she had come to trust, her own voice, steady and clear. Eli stood beside his father throughout. At the end, when the judge had done his part and Hank had produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, and the hands were celebrating in the particular boisterous way of men who are genuinely happy for someone, Eli came to stand beside Margaret at the table where she was cutting the cake. He stood there for a moment in his good clothes with his uncombed hair and his father's watchful eyes. "Ma," he said, "just that, just the word." Margaret set down the cake knife. She turned to look at him. He looked back at her with the direct, serious, all-in way that was simply how he engaged with everything that mattered to him. He had said it, and having said it, he was not going to unsay it or qualify it or pretend he hadn't. He was his father's son. She put her hand briefly on the back of his head, the way she would have with Button or Ruthie or Danny, not sentimental, not overwhelming, just present, just there. "Go get us both some cake," she said. He went. She turned back to the table and looked out over the yard, the hands with their whiskey, Hank laughing at something, Tom across the yard talking to the judge with the ease she hadn't seen on him in public before the east pasture beyond the fence in the full green of a Montana summer. She had come here with $23 and a recipe book and a letter that said, "Send the fare." She had come not knowing if she would find a good man or a hard life or anything worth the distance. She had found all three in various measures and had discovered that the hard life and the good man were not separate things, but part of the same thing, a life built on honest work and honest words, and the willingness to stay when staying was difficult. She had found a home, not a borrowed sofa in someone else's house, not 30 stolen minutes in a kitchen that wasn't hers. A home, this house, this land, this kitchen, with the dried wildflowers in the jar on the windowsill and the recipe book on the shelf, and the boy who had just called her Ma in the voice he used for things that were real. Tom came across the yard toward her. He moved through the noise and the celebration with the same unhurried, purposeful walk that had first crossed a train platform to meet her in October. And he came to stand beside her at the table, and without making a point of it, without ceremony, he put his hand at the small of her back in the quiet, habitual way of a man who has decided where he belongs and is done deliberating. "Cake," she said. "In a minute," he said. He looked at the yard, the pasture, the mountains beyond the long, wide sky. "I found a letter," she said, "in the study, in November. I should tell you." He looked at her sideways. "The one in the box on the shelf," she said. "The one you never sent." He was quiet for a moment. "You read it." "I did. I know I shouldn't have." He thought about this. "What did you think of it?" "I thought you were more hopeful than you knew," she said. He looked at the pasture. Maybe, he said. She thought about the words she had read in the cold of the cellar room. I hope you're kind. That's all I ever really needed. She looked at the man beside her, at his hand, at her back, at the line of his shoulders, at the gray at his temples, that she had come to know as well as she knew anything. She put her hand over his at her back. I'm kind, she said. I know it took you a while to find out, but I am. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, clearly fully without reservation, he smiled. Not the corner of his mouth, not the barely there shift she had learned to watch for. A full, real smile, the kind that changed his whole face, the kind that Eleanor had been able to make happen, that had been missing for 2 years, that was not missing anymore. I know, he said. Eli appeared between them with 2 pieces of cake, one in each hand, and held them up. Margaret took hers, Tom took his. The three of them stood at the table in the June afternoon, under the enormous Montana sky with the party going on around them, and the east pasture running green and clear, all the way to the creek, and ate their cake in the simple, ordinary, irreplaceable way of people who have found the place where they belong and are no longer afraid to call it home. She had come as an answer to a letter. She had stayed as the home he never knew he needed. And in the end, that was the whole of it, not ordered, not arranged, not the product of beauty or bargain or careful calculation. Just 2 honest people reaching toward each other across the shaded and difficult country of their lives, finding what they had each, without quite knowing it, been looking for all along.